I think it's really exciting. Stephen is here from the US. He's a veteran trade union organiser who organised the Justice for Janitors Campaign and has a lot of really exciting ideas and strategies to share with us about ways of combating financialisation, combating neoliberalism. We don't have to wait for the Labour Party to do all this for us. We can actually organise these in our unions and achieve massive gains. And Scott's got some exciting insights to share on that and ways of developing campaigns and strategies for winning that can go beyond just winning better pay and benefits in the workplace, but also win broader demands for working people. So Valery's going to do a bit more of an introduction, but I thought that would be helpful.
I don't need to say anything, you covered it all.
Yeah, so I'm Valery Alzaga, and I actually live and work in the UK, but I'm actually originally from Mexico, and I was a migrant in the US, so Trump favorite person, sure. And I actually started as an organizer a long time ago. I didn't have any gray hair, and I worked under the Justice for Janitors Campaign. So actually Stephen is a long-time friend and mentor, and Charlie and I thought it would be very good to bring him over and to invite him to talk to us about what has he been up to after Justice for Janitors, and what is it about bargaining for the common good that could be helpful here in the UK. And so as a way of introducing this, I mean, I think for me as a young activist, I was part of the anti-globalization movement and doing a lot of actions and getting arrested and having fun, but also very much understanding that we were hitting serious limits, right? Like we were not winning, we were losing. And Justice for Janitors was a campaign that was about organizing undocumented workers and actually fighting big multinational corporations and winning. And for me, that was a pretty amazing thing. And I got to organize a lot of Latino and Latinx sisters and brothers actually, and did fantastic work. And I've been working in the trade, union movement for about 20 years, and we won a lot. And winning was something that I think trade unions at that time in the United States were just not very good at. Social movements less, I would argue. And so for me, it was a very important lesson, like how do we win? How do we kick some ass? How do we actually distribute wealth? How do we regulate? How do we win for workers and their families? How do we do this differently, And so I also want to say that for me, Justice for Janitors was not only kind of big thinking and strategic know-how from people like Stephen, and you'll see the degree of analysis that always went into campaigning, but it was also about working with a lot of migrants that came from social movements and campaigns and all types of amazing revolutionary movements. So we were also learning from them how to organize. And so it was a very rich space, I think, of experimentation, at least for me as a young organizer. But I think one of the questions that we wanted to bring Stephen around is, how do we win? And what is it that, this new approach and strategy that he's been working on with a lot of very, very kind of not only interesting, but I think very important community and union leaders in the United States. What is it that, that can teach us? And so I just wanted to say that for me, it's very great to have him here. And we're going to have him just do a presentation, and then we're going to open it to a conversation and questions and anything that you may want to expand on. But for me, like I said, as a trade unionist here in the UK, I would argue that I came with a notion that this is where unions started, and I was going to find powerful unions taking over and striking for the NHS and doing blockages, And I found unions that were themselves trying to figure out how to fight back, how to organize, and how to campaign. And so I've been in the process of supporting in particular Unison, but also obviously being a part of a larger movement, which brings me here. So I would say, Stephen,
Thanks
for coming.
Thanks for having. So as a warning, I took the red eye, so I think I may be closing in on 24 hours. So if I'm incoherent, feel free to jump in. I actually, well, I have a PowerPoint because I was told to have it. I'm going to sort of go back and forth, and I'd really prefer to make this more of a conversation than at 8 o'clock at night on the last day of your conference lecture. But what would be helpful to me, since it's a small group, is if we just went around the room and folks said what the name is and sort of why they're in, why they came to this thing. Are they part of a union? Are they part of a social movement? It just help give me a little context.
Sure. My name's Frank, so I just started as in the legal department at United Voices of the World, which is a sister union to IWGB.
I'm Annabelle. I work sometimes with the GMB, working with cleaners, and I'm also involved in the London Renters Union.
I'm Sean. I'm in the IWW in Birmingham. It's not very active. I guess I'm more involved in other campaigning and work co-op stuff.
Hi, I'm Sam. Pretty much exactly what you said. IWW in Birmingham, non-active at the moment.
Hi. Hi, I'm Dimitri, and I'm with TWT. I'm working with TWT.
I'm Barbara. I'm with the Working Families Party in the U.S. and in Oregon, where I'm living now. Our state committee is almost all private sector unions.
I'm Steve. I'm from the United States but live in Europe and connected to the Working Families Party, but also a background from the trade union movement in the United States. And I'm here specifically to learn more about bargaining for the common good because of a desire to work with Valery to develop trainings around it.
I'm Blue. I'm working at a few sort of charities, campaigns, just about organising things like that.
Hi, I'm Erin. I'm a library worker from Luton. I'm also a Unison member. And libraries our libraries are being hit really hard by the society.
Yeah.
It's almost unrecognised, so I'm interested in. Yeah. Big stuff.
Hi, I'm Gareth. Started out working alongside Unite as one of the kind of branch officials, and now work for the ITF, which is the Global Union Federation for Transport.
I'm Willow, and I'm a Irish person living in London in these times, very challenging.
Yeah.
I'm a long-time union member. I started a union when I was 16 in my job in Ireland, and used it very well back at that time. So I'm a member of the NEU at the moment, but I'm going to transfer to Unite because it doesn't seem relevant to me in this stage of things. And I'm a grassroots activist involved in homelessness, campaigning, and street kitchens and night shelter. We created a liminal space last year and housed 17 people full-time and 59 people throughout the course of the winter, and we're engaged at the moment in doing that again. Yeah.
I'm Mick. I'm an organiser with Unite. I've been for about 15 years. So I met Valery when we were starting off in the T&G, starting off organising. And I wanted to come here because I read some of your stuff back in the 90s, the debates in the AFL-CIO about blocking bridges or building bridges and this. And I still give that out to our organisers now, our new organisers, to read and have a start a discussion about what's your trade unionism look like. Should it be about finding compromise, or should it be actually about finding conflict and taking on the bosses? So yeah, that's me. I come from a similar sort of background, anti-capitalist, Marxist sort of activity, lots of getting arrested and stuff, and there was the seriousness, the win, but also the confrontational, radical sort of approach of organising. Got me.
I'm called Charlie. I'm a staff organiser with the IWGB Union, and I'm interested in, we've got quite a good win rate stuff. And we've had some really exciting campaigns. I'm interested in how we can try and develop that further and build a broader politics into that, so that we can, I don't know, fight for broader gains as well.
So, I've given the one cautionary statement, I'm exhausted, and the second, I have no idea how relevant what I'm going to talk about is to folks in the UK, but Valerie threw out a bunch of acronyms, so I just want to check if people have heard of. Who here has heard of the Justice for Janitors Campaign? It's fine if you haven't. Did anybody see the Ken Loach movie, Bread and Roses? That was about the Justice for Janitors Campaign. And if you look carefully in the worker meeting where they're showing real video of the police attacking us, I'm the guy that used to have hair and a beard being clubbed by the police. So you have to look very carefully. You can see me on the bottom of the pile. It's where I learned a very valuable lesson. When the police attack you, do not take their billy club away. Because we had this moment where they're getting us, and just defensively I grabbed their club, and then every cop's pointing at me. I'm saying, no, take it back. But anyway. So, important lesson, remember that. So, I'll come to the Justice for Janitors Campaign in a second. And has anybody here heard of bargaining for common good before this? Okay. And third, do people know the word or use the word financialization? Anybody want to give it a short definition?
Kostas Lapavitsas has written a lot about it. I mean, I guess it's to do with the idea of taking services and transforming them from use values into exchange values. So it's about turning things that we need, like housing and education, into financial vehicles for profit. That's how I understand it.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different definitions, but the idea is that you make money off of money, and that everything gets commodified, and then you sell it for a price. So if you have so I'll come back to it, but it's a key thing that's happening in capitalism that I'm going to talk about. I'm just doing my survey. Who here has ever been involved in union negotiations, actually bargaining? Okay, so the points I'm going to try to hit, and then you can test me at the end to see if it did, is one, I want to talk about financialization and capitalism, and what that's meant in terms of the entity that is our employer increasingly is not the real power. Meaning the person who signs the paycheck, or the entity, the company, there's multiple levels above them, increasingly financial institutions that control their fate. So one, I want to talk about that and what that means about organizing. Second, I want to talk about power analysis, which is how do we figure out who really has power and then where all their arms are. And increasingly in a financialized economy, has anybody ever heard of the company Blackstone, the private equity company? So they're huge in the US, they employ 500,000 people, and they're the biggest landlord, and they're the biggest residential landlord and office landlord, and they're in 20 other businesses. So part of what we try to think about is, well, it doesn't help just to think about fighting them on one arm if they've got 20 arms. And then I want to talk about this idea that if we do power analysis and if we understand financialization, then we're going to find corporate entities at the top that are doing bad things to lots of different groups. And a lot of times, at least in the US, what happens is we all try to convince other groups that our cause is the most important, trade unionism is the most important thing, or environmentalism is the most important. And then we form these very silly coalitions where we all sign on to a letter and promise to do things that we won't do because we're all like really busy. And so the core idea that I want to come to is that if we have a power analysis and we understand who these giant firms are, is that we can align all sorts of social forces to fight them at the same time. Not because one cause is more important than the other, but because we got the same bad guy at the top. So you can test me at the end if I explain this in that way. And so I'm going to jump around. I'm going to do a little bit of the PowerPoint, but folks should feel free to jump in. And which button am I pushing here?
All the way to the right, yeah, the other one?
Right, so the first question, I don't know if this looks familiar, and I'm not going to read these slides, General, I'm going to go through it very quickly. But the context we have in the US, this may seem familiar: massive inequality, concentration of wealth, financialization, and key part of that, the defunding of the public sector and privatization. That seem a little similar on both sides of the pond? And that this is, you don't need to look at the exact figures here, but this is just how the tax structure in the US has completely changed, which is essentially the more money you have, the less tax you pay, and the tax have shifted to regular people. This shows the difference going back to the 30s. It used to be that corporations paid the majority of tax. Now it's people pay the majority of tax. I don't know if this is the same here. And that one of the things that this has all been about is the Wall Street crash devastated public revenues. And it devastated public revenues and then became the excuse to implement greater and greater austerity. And I don't know if your pension funds here are underfunded. Is that an expression here? That there's not enough money saved up to pay the pensions?
So they say.
What?
So they say.
So they say, but what this slide is about is that if you add up the tax breaks that we give companies, it's far greater than the so-called shortfall to pay pensions. And this slide is just showing again.
Is there some way to make it so that it's not blurry on the bottom, like maybe just tilting the...
No,
No?
I can actually read what it says.
Apologized.
Okay.
What does it say on the bottom? It basically says the one line is manufacturing, one is finance, and one is what it's just showing is that the economy, the profits of the percentage of the economy that is finance versus either manufacturing or creating things is greater and greater, is what that says. And then finally, if you look globally, where is the money?
I get it. Sorry, guys. I'm just trying to.
Okay, what this says on the bottom is it tracks going back to the 50s, what percentage of corporate profits came from the finance sector. And when I say finance sector, I mean banks, private equity, hedge funds, all those kinds of things. And you see this brief dip, you see the dip in the middle. That was when the US economy and the world economy crashed. But what it then shows is that, do you know who Willie Sutton was in America? He was a famous bank robber. And they asked him why he robbed banks. And he said, because that's where the money is. It was a deep political analysis on his part. And the point I'm getting to is that if you want to know where the money is and what's driving the economy, it's the finance sector. And in the US, for many years, we didn't think about this. We thought we had an employer, and we're going to fight that employer really hard to get something. And we hadn't adjusted to sort of how the economy had reorganized. So I'm going to, everybody with me so far? This making sense? Even though you can't read the slides, but I can't read them either, so what the hell. But it's a core part of the analysis, which is who are we fighting, right? It's like even if you take the auto companies in the US, their profits have been driven by their finance arms of selling the cars and the fees they make selling them versus the manufacturing. It's a total reorganization of the economy. And so I want to sort of walk you through my own thinking on how we ended up with this idea called bargaining for common good by starting with janitors. But first, I figure if somebody told their early story, I should say who I am a teeny bit. Anybody hear of the United Farm Workers Union in the United States? It was Cesar Chavez, it was a long time ago. So I got involved in the movement when I was a volunteer for the farm workers at 16, and I fell in love with the idea of you could change the world. So I did what any logical person would do, is I dropped out of high school and became a union organizer, and that's sort of what I've done my whole life outside of working in a hospital and being a plastic extrusion operator, which anybody who, those little earring cards that women's earrings come on, those plastic things. I used to make those in Providence, Rhode Island. The great thing was that all the folks would say, and then I'll get serious, it was a shitty little sweatshop, and you hand-fed the plastic through this cutting machine, and you'd say, what's the retirement plan? And the old guys would, you got in Rhode Island by the digit, you got money by how much was cut off. So the old guys would put up they had 5 stubs in one finger. He says, I'm almost ready to retire. One more digit gets cut off and I can retire. So that's a little American story. I thought you might appreciate it. But anyway, in the Justice for Janitors campaign, which has really shaped my thinking, is do people know how the janitorial industry works, basically? You work for a cleaning contractor, right? And everybody thought, well, we have to war with the greedy cleaning contractor because they're terrible, they pay us the lowest pay, they're horrible. But we had this theory that the cleaning contractor is just really a payroll agency. You know, they've been hired to clean, but we had to understand who really had power. And we had to understand how they were screwing other people and what their schemes were. But the key thing is we had to bargain and organize with who had the money and power, and it wasn't the cleaning contractor. And that may sound like a common sense, but it was a radical idea because both in law and tradition, you're fighting your boss. Except the problem is our boss was just a chicken shit little operator, even if they were big, that worked on a couple % profit margin. And so you could war with them forever and get a teeny bit of raise, but it didn't deal with the way this industry was structured. So we had this very, and people read this one. So we had this very simple thing, which is that on the bottom, you know, you had workers, and they worked for a contractor. But then we said, and this is all of our thinking, well, how do you go the next step up? So many people then had property management firms, right, that actually hired the cleaning contractor. But then that person was in turn often hired by a real estate investment trust, which was a way to avoid taxes. And then they in turn were owned by a building owner. And then the building owner, if the chart could go on, raised its capital from pension plans, often union workers' money. And so we said, if we're gonna win, we can't fight the bottom, we have to fight the top. And folks should all jump in if something's not making sense. And then we said, when we fight them, we have to hit them in all different ways, that we can't just have one tactic. Workers could go on strike forever, but there's an unending number of scabs that could be brought in, so it wasn't just sufficient to strike. We needed to look at each level of what workers could do, how we put pressure on the contractors, what the regulations were, how we embarrassed them, what the role of tenants were. I won't go through all of it, but we said we need many, many different tactics going after the same companies to beat them to go to the top of the top of the pyramid. And for those who don't know, we organized like 200,000 workers in the United States. We won what would now be called sectoral agreements. We won citywide agreements in almost all the major US cities where we basically took wages out of competition. Every company had to pay the exact same thing, and the cost was borne by the building owner. And the interesting math on it, the cleaning contractor was 95 to 98% of their cost was labor. For the building owner, it was insignificant. So the key analysis was there's somebody really rich up here who we're financing with union pension money, who going union has no significant financial impact. So let's fight that person. And these are often very prominent folks. So that was sort of the theory of the Justice for Janitors campaign. And I don't have time to tell the many tales, but people were referencing, were making some jokes about bridges. So, you know, one of the things that we did, the kind of thing we would do is the campaign was built on how do you create a crisis both for the building owners and the ruling groups in each city. So in Washington, D.C., I think the one before this was about dealing with making protests illegal. We were under court orders, we couldn't do anything, we weren't allowed to picket. So we had a very simple idea, let's just shut down Washington, D.C. And we parked school buses across all the bridges into the district and set up classrooms. And the guy that we were fighting, Oliver Carr, didn't pay tax. So our whole campaign was built around car trouble. Notice the little subtle humor is very important. His name was Carr, car trouble. Should I do it one more time? It's late, I know. And
what
so,
you did there. That's good.
Sorry, I did. So we parked, you know, and little did we know how bad traffic could be. And U.S. Congress did not meet. The Supreme Court did not meet. I'd forgotten to tell our union president we were going to do this. I don't know how I forgot to tell him. He called me up, he was not happy, as senators and Congress people were calling. And then it led to this great debate you were referencing in the labor movement, which is, are we building bridges or blocking bridges? But the point of it was, we realized that the only way to win was to create a crisis for the ruling groups of Washington. And that led ultimately to us getting an agreement where all of Washington became unionized. So, questions so far? Anything I should add? And I'll tell one more story just tied to that that's an example. In LA, after what is infamously called the LA police riot, where they attacked and 60 people were hospitalized, 2 women miscarried, 1 person actually ultimately died from the police beatings. I ended up in a meeting with the mayor of Los Angeles, who called the biggest building owner, who is in Chicago, and said to him, "You need to settle with the union." And the guy said, "Why?" And the mayor said, "Because my city will not burn, because you want to pay less money in LA than in Chicago." And some people say, well, why didn't you just lobby the mayor on the front end if he had all that power? Because he wouldn't give building permits. And he didn't give a shit about the union. He really thought that the level of conflict was so great that the city, and this was during, for those who know the history of Rodney King and the uprisings in LA. So the point was that we built such tension and we understood who the bad guys were. And so we've now taken that analysis to say, and I actually hate this slide because it says 1%, it should actually say the 1/10 of 1%. Because I think the 1% figure is just your average rich people versus your billionaires. But what our theory is based on is that finance, capital, banking, private equity increasingly drive everything, and that they in turn control all of these different sectors of the economy. And I'll go into it more, and that we need to build that into our analysis. And that led us to say, well, if these are the folks that are really in charge, how do we figure out who they are? And then how do we get them to the table? How do we force them to deal with us? This is a slow computer. Okay. Oh, I already said that. How do we bring them to the table? So we developed this thing called bargaining for the common good. And here's sort of the crazy thing. The three convening organizations is a fabulous group called ACRE, which is the Action Center on Race and the Economy that focuses on Wall Street's extraction of wealth from communities of color. And then Rutgers University in Georgetown, which is this bizarre thing that we've created, we call it Switzerland, a neutral zone, that we can bring unions and community groups together where they don't fight each other. I don't know if you have any of these issues here about, you know, fighting amongst ourselves. But the question is, what do we mean by bargaining for common good? And forget the definition on the wall, but the idea here is that I feel like we've allowed an elaborate trick to be played on us, at least in the United States, which is they've said that you really should only bargain over wages and benefits. That's sort of how the union's viewed. And then when we bargain over wages and benefits, they say, aren't you selfish and greedy? You only care about yourself. And so the idea behind bargaining for common good is that we can use the bargaining moment of big contracts to demand things that go way beyond wages and benefits, that engage the community, that turn this into a struggle with the biggest, richest corporations more. And what the word we use is we politicize bargaining. And I'll give you a simple example to try to make this make sense to you. In St. Paul, Minnesota, I'm sure a place you've all been to, the teachers union was bargaining during the recession, and they bargained that the school district would not do business with any bank that foreclosed during the school year. Now, think about what's more logical for teachers. They're saying, what's hurting our student learning? I think 10% of the student body was homeless. And it turned out there was also already a law in Minnesota, going back to the Depression, saying that you could not foreclose on a farmer during peak harvest season. And so they said to the school district, we want you to agree you won't deal with any bank that forecloses during the school year. And the school district said, you're crazy, we don't have to bargain about that. And so they brought 100 parents to the bargaining table and they expanded the union bargaining committee.
Oh, I sorry, we're just getting a couple of English.
What's that?
Just ignore me. Oh, I need to make it a little bit.
So anyway, the idea was that by expanding the scope of our bargaining, we made the union relevant to a whole set of people who weren't particularly concerned about what the teacher's pay or benefit was. But it also made the union much stronger because all of a sudden the school district, and, you know, in the US, I don't know about here, there's been an unrelenting right-wing campaign to say the public sector is inefficient and terrible, public workers are greedy and horrible, they do a terrible job, and all we need to do is privatize everything and life will be perfect. You haven't experienced that here at all, right?
Lots of it.
And so, so the theory behind bargaining for common good is that we can bring all sorts of different groups together, confront employers around a new set of demands that both makes the union stronger and also makes those other community groups or other groups stronger because we're going after somebody big and powerful on multiple issues. I just want to slow down and see if this is making sense, or you want to, because I'm going to go into more detail, but if that's...
Is there any questions?
And no, and one of the ironies is there's nothing new about this. This is what unions in the United States used to do before we were so-called successful. So I won't read the whole list, but if you go back, that's where unions started. The Knights of Labor had mixed labor community assemblies. There was this understanding that there were powerful monopoly forces and you needed to take them on, and we lost this. So I want to stress we're going back to where we were. And so when I say why bargaining in common good ways, it's not to be nice. It's not because we care about poor people or we care that people don't have decent housing. All that's true. It's because it's how you build the power to win. And it's because we can identify powerful opposition and go after them together. And we can win more bigger things together. So I'm not going to go through the list just because of time, but we've won sort of pretty bizarre things that you never think a union would negotiate. Sanctuary schools, that immigration won't be allowed in for deportation. We've won all sorts of things about police out of schools. We've won things on class size. We can email everybody, get you more information, but we have a marvelous thing about the things we bargained on: racial justice, climate justice, education. I'm going to get into more detail. But we keep expanding what we're bargaining about, and then we combine that with deep political education with people. And sort of the, oh, there's a list. Oh, there's a librarian here, right? Didn't we have a librarian?
No, well, library.
So, library, right. But anyway, like one of the things that we've won in Los Angeles was smaller class size, hiring of counselors, green spaces. The city actually put money into a fund to defend immigrant workers. These are all things, are these things unions typically negotiate for here? No. I'm going to skip that. So there's sort of 7 elements, and this gets a little technical, but it will be helpful, which I'm going to walk, you don't need to look at them, I'm going to walk through one by one. So the first element of this is expand the scope beyond wages and benefits. And this is really the fun part, both for most union members, kids also go to school, they also live somewhere. So most union members are like incredibly excited that the union is expanding its horizons and saying, I want to look at all parts of your life. And then second, it brings also to allies in. And so I'll come back to some of the things we've bargained. The second is we want to go on offense. In the United States, almost the entire labor movement in my life has been on defense. How do we stop from giving things up? How do we call them concessions, I don't know what the word is here. The idea behind bargaining for common good is at a moment of historic weakness, people's tendency is to narrow their demands. We're lucky if we get anything. Our idea is the opposite. At a moment of historic weakness, we need audacious and grander demand. Who the hell wants to join a movement that's already given up and says the best thing you can do is slow your rate of decline? So the idea behind bargaining for common good is that we're relentlessly going on offense and identifying issues that go beyond just wages and benefits, but are all tied into how capitalism is reorganized. And so we literally do bargaining surveys. In your union, do they ever do a survey about what kind of things you should bargain about? We now do community bargaining surveys. In LA, they had open meetings of community groups and said, what would you like us to bargain about? So we're expanding and looking at, in the United States, there's a grand tradition of when a union's in trouble, they want the help of community groups. And then as soon as they settle, they forget them. I don't know if that happens here. Or we also call it rent-a-collar. Can I go find a minister to say the union's good? And then, go ahead.
Would you do that like when you're getting the community groups in, would that be specifically when you're negotiating, you're bargaining against like a city council?
No, see, this is a key thing. It may be a government entity, though our analysis is normally that government entity has been, and it's totally hamstrung by the finance forces that mean why they don't have any money. But we do it like a year before we enter bargaining. Not say, what are the big issues here? And yes, but we would, like the LA teachers did that before they went to bargain. We in the United States, I think you probably know, have a legacy of, not a legacy, of white supremacy and growing white nationalism. So we center racial justice in everything we do. Even if it's an all-white crowd, we lift up the question of the history of what we would call racialized capitalism, because it's important for people to understand how we got in the mess we're in. And so that's a key part of our elements. The other part is the obvious, that we have to go deep with members. Like, you can't just come up with creative demands and then expect members to go on strike for them. We spend a year going deep with folks about why they're important. And then in some ways, this is one of the most important ones. In the United States, we have $4 trillion of capital that's housed in some ways in what we'd call deferred workers' paychecks, which is pension money. You know, every state has multiple pension plans. And I call it assisted suicide, which is our pension funds invest in companies whose mission is to not pay taxes and to privatize everything. And it's sort of crazy and absurd. So a lot of what we do is we try to track all the money that we should have a say in what's happening in, which is union pension funds. I think the California Public Employment Retirement System, I think, is the largest form of capital in the whole United States. And all of these evil companies come lining up, and because they say the returns are a teeny bit better than something else, we invest in them. So understanding that money, where it came from, and how to influence it is a key part of our work. And I assume you have similar things here, pension schemes that invest in all sorts of things. And so I'll give
private equity in particular, right?
Yes, private equity. Private equity, the driver, KKI. And it's sort of, I actually had this experience where right before the financial collapse in the US, I was speaking at the Washington State Pension Board, which is heavily invested in a company called KKR. If you don't know KKR, they're the ones, the book Barbarians at the Gate, about Nabisco being destroyed. I don't have time to go through it all. And my testimony was which I want to be clear, I didn't write it, somebody much smarter than me wrote it, but I read it really, really well. And what the testimony was essentially is that the short-termism of trying to get a big return by doing bad things is like eating your corn seed or cutting off your own leg, and that ultimately they would crash the whole economy. And everybody laughed at me about I was this unsophisticated, I didn't understand how capital worked and all this, and 6 months later the economy crashed. So I felt really good about that, but not really. And the final thing, and this is really important, is that, I think this is the final thing, I don't know, there may be more final things, but is that the idea that this can't be a transactional relationship where you go to community and other groups and say, help us in our bargaining and we'll fight for you, and then as soon as the contract's done, because you don't win everything, you forget them, that this is really just an entry point to building an alignment of groups to challenge the biggest, most powerful private equity and other companies. And then for those who want to write any of it, well, I guess we can get people websites and stuff. So before I get more specific, let me stop for a second. Anybody want to add anything? Am I missing anything? I'm doing this at hyperspeed because it's late and I haven't slept.
I was just going to say, I think the pensions thing is a bit different.
Yeah, so how do
you have union-controlled pensions?
They're not controlled by unions. There's labor management. So okay. So we have two kinds of pension schemes. We have the public employee ones. Unions have trustees, but we do not control them. And the key thing is most of the trustees are captured by management, meaning you have a rank and file worker who's now elected to the pension board. They're completely intimidated by the finance guys who say, you're going to destroy your pension if you don't invest in this great deal. And so a lot of the work we're doing is training pension trustees. We literally, in New Jersey, they were invested in Blackstone and another company called TPG that you may or may not have heard of, but they're pretty evil fuckers. That's a term of art in the United States, evil fucker. And right after the hurricane in Puerto Rico, they were starting to foreclose on people. You know, after the hurricane hits and we're here for your house. And we got the pension plans in New Jersey to tell them we'll never invest in you again if you foreclose. And literally, union pension members were threatened that this was, the word is fiduciarily unadvisable. And we're threatened, and so you really have to train them. Then we have private pension plans, which for construction and manufacturing, but there too it's labor management. We don't control them, but we could exercise much more control if we wanted to.
But that's how they get you, isn't it? Fiduciary duties. They'll say that you have a duty to get a return on capital.
Right.
And by
maximum return.
Exactly, and and so there's this complete failure to consider social and environmental returns.
Exactly.
And surely they can go after you in the courts as well. They can shareholders or people who have an equitable stake in the fund can sue the fund managers
Yeah, I mean, we've become pretty good at making, I mean, that's part of the work we do, like making a fiduciary argument why it may make money in the short run.
Right.
But so, for example, in California, investing in a private equity company that owns a for-profit college that directly competes with the unionized professors, the argument we make is maybe you get a teeny bit better return, but if we lose 10,000 members who then don't pay into the fund. But it's all ridiculous that we have to go through these hoops to argue the normal logical thing. In the case of private equity, for those who want to dig in on it, we've also done a very good job of showing that they hide their fees and their returns are nowhere what they claim. But that's, you know, another part of the work. But other thoughts or questions so far?
I'm wondering if you could linger just for a second on this question of the alignment, building the alignment. I feel like that obvious, it seems obvious, and it also seems like the kind of thing that doesn't happen just automatically.
Right.
How does that sense of being in it together develop organically
or
through this process?
Yeah, so that's
if that's possible.
That's a brilliant segue because
you're welcome.
So let me go into a little detail about LA, and this will help on this. I don't know if people followed the Los Angeles teacher strike like 6 months ago, but the first part of the story is they elected new rank and file leadership a couple years ago. And that leadership, am I allowed to say that?
Yes.
It's factual. And what's interesting about it, the local president, who became a guy named Alex Caputo Perla, became president, had come to the first Bargaining for Common Good conference a couple years earlier. And their first step was to go incredibly deep with their members about, and they basically spent 2 or 3 years preparing for a strike. But then on this question of alignment, they did a deep analysis in LA of, we sometimes call them the dirty dozen. Who are the biggest corporate actors? And what were all the bad things that they did? So you might see we have them, the privatizer bunch there. And we spent over a year documenting that many of these people that were seen as being philanthropic, I don't know if you have like wealthy people here that after they rob you, they sprinkle some fairy dust on you and claim it's all really, they're really nice people, is we spent a long time both researching them and then mapping everything that they did bad to different communities. So we were able to show that the same people that were funding, in the United States we call them charter schools, you know, which is basically the privatization.
Academies for here.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That the same people who were funding those were also some of the biggest landlords that were raising rent. We also could show that they were the biggest lobbyists for cutting taxes. And so we were able to paint a picture of a set of billionaires who lived in LA who in multiple ways used their wealth to rig, as Donald Trump would say, to rig the system. And so, and we didn't just do it as analysis. We then, for over a year, ran demos and actions and sit-ins. And we basically took down some of the most prominent, well-loved people by showing that they were doing horrible things. And so that then led to the folks who are, we get actually on the victory side passed statewide rent control in California last week. But we were able to show that the same people funding the campaign to oppose new rent laws were the same people opposed to public education. Then we went through their environmental records. So essentially, when you took the biggest, richest guys, this is what we did, the power analysis, we mapped everything they owned, every legislation they supported, all the ways they avoided taxes, and we said, these are the people who are against making our schools better. And then as we developed demands, is this getting to what you wanted to get to? And then as we developed demands, the demands were both tied directly to the schools, but also tied to broader campaigns. And one of the things, for example, that we demand in LA, we didn't win this one, was that no, because you have to fight another day, that no excess school property could be sold to a private developer, that it had to stay public, and that it could be used to develop affordable housing, but it couldn't be used to do other things. And we were able then to show that the exact same people that were for shutting schools and privatizing them, surprise, surprise, they were in the real estate industry. And we were also able to, you know, we mapped their political contributions, so members and community members would say, hey, these are the guys that are screwing us on everything. And then And then this is just a list of, you know, of the groups that signed on to the campaign. So there's a teachers union, but then there's Lane, which is like is a community group that does economic policy stuff. There's ACE, I won't read them all, but we then built out a broad alignment of groups who said, I want to make our schools work, and I want to transform tax policy, and I don't want you to destroy the globe and the world. And that led to this dynamic when the strike happened, that it was sort of the most extraordinary strike I've witnessed, because pre-strike the union was not particularly well liked. It was seen as sort of the bastion of privileged teachers who only cared about themselves and didn't care about students. And on the local school board election, the union had just gotten beaten right before the strike because the other side had momentum. And the amazing thing that happened is that as this strike rolled out, by the end of 2 weeks, parents were saying this is a parent-student strike for better schools. That it totally transformed how the union was seen. The next school board election, the left candidate won overwhelmingly, a woman named Jackie Goldberg. And so it totally transformed the politics of LA, including, I think, setting up why we now were able just to pass rent control, why I think we're going to overturn some of the tax laws. And then just to jump ahead and screw the PowerPoint, because I think I'm going off it. Have you heard the expression broke on purpose? So this is what our simple analysis of financialization is that the first thing corporations do is they cut workers' wages so they can make more money, right? That's normal. But then in the United States, at least, after you cut workers' wages and they can no longer afford to pay the bills, you set up something called payday loans, which are usurious loans. So you now make more money because you're lending money to individual workers to pay the bills. Then they do the same thing to government, which is they cut taxes, which then means there's not enough money. But then they do financial deals, predatory deals, where they loan the very government they just defunded money, and they make more money doing that. Then they say, well, we all just have to be normal, logical people. There's not enough money. So of course, all of you down here have to fight about what gets funded. You know, do you want more money for daycare or for schools? And the Chicago teachers really developed this idea called broke on purpose. That they purposely bankrupt the state or the city or the council, whatever, making money doing it. Then they make more money loaning you money. And in the case of the United States, the latest thing we have now, I don't know if you know about the situation in Puerto Rico, which I won't try to explain, except the final step is then saying, after you bankrupted the entity, you say, oh, these silly people, they borrow so much money, we need a government, a financial control board to take over and eviscerate democracy altogether. And then they, by fiat, implement austerity. And
privatize and sell everything.
Yes, so in Puerto Rico after the hurricane there, closed 300 schools, they're privatizing the power company. They're using that as an excuse to do their agenda, but it's the very same people who profited by getting Puerto Rico in the mess they're in. Is that getting closer?
Yeah, no, I think that, I think it makes a lot of sense, certainly in the context of a strike, with that sense of deeper alignment, like getting past the sort of coalition gumbo of all these names on a page, everybody signs on to something, but like that sense of like truly being in a deeper alignment, I could see how that's forged in the crucible of a strike. And I'm wondering if there's ways to sort of, short of a strike in this process, develop that deeper sense of like, we are deeply committed to each other's common good here.
Yeah, I mean, we have relatively few. It's only in the last year or two that we've started having strikes in the United States. Right. And so most of this happens as a combination of having a shared analysis, vision, and goals. And, you know, we, again, we're doing what we call developing the dirty dozen in most states, which is the evilest companies that dominate each state. And then exactly what we do is we start working with all the different groups. So our friends Blackstone, that some of you have heard of, I don't know if people saw the Intercept article about them burning the Amazon. They're like the classic example of a company that we're building out this alignment. We're forming a tenants union of Blackstone renters. Many Blackstone workers are already union and are negotiating. The janitors are union, a lot of the hotel workers are union. We're looking at their non-union sides of the company. It turns out that they also are a lender and a debt collector. So we've mapped each part of Blackstone, and we've done this for all the private equity companies in the US, everything they own. And then we basically, what is the group that cares about that? And then we say, well, you know what? Why don't we all fight at the same time against them? But I'll give an even cleaner example. I don't know if you know the department store chain in the US called Target. It's sort of so in Minnesota, Target's based there. They are the most powerful entity. So they did all the research. I won't bore you with that. So then 3 different groups went after, sorry about that, I don't know, the East Coast, they don't realize it's 8:30 in the United States. So people went after Target on 3 issues. One, how they treated their immigrant janitors. So a worker center, very similar to you, Satul was organizing the janitors. Second, in the United States, there's a movement called Ban the Box, which is to say that companies are not allowed to ask an employment application if you have a criminal record, because it's really just become a Trojan horse to discriminate against people of color. And third, that they didn't pay tax. And so all the different groups went after Target at the exact same time over their issues. So Satul was organizing the immigrant janitors. Something called Take Action and civil rights groups were organizing and banning the box, et cetera, et cetera. We also didn't say you can't settle till we settle. We said if you can get a deal, God bless you, as long as you don't dime us out. So they settled on the janitors first, and which then led to 1,000 more janitors getting organized. But the most interesting thing was they agreed to ban the box, that they no longer would ask if you had a criminal record. They then went to the Chamber of Commerce, which is the business group, and said, we had been trying for years to pass it as legislation, to make it illegal, and the business community was united, and we could never beat them. Once we split the business community, or in some places we'd call it the ruling class, but we don't have that in the United States. It's all just based on people working hard and being rewarded for their hard work. But that was American sarcasm for those who don't know me. What happened was Target went to the Chamber of Commerce and said, we're stuck with this. You can't lobby. You can't take a position on this. And so the Chamber went neutral and we passed the legislation.
For everybody.
For everybody, statewide. And so the point was that we understood who had power. That was the analysis. We found all the things, and it's a very comprehensive campaign. I don't have time to go through it. What Target cared about, which was significantly their image in this case. But then in beating them, we set the stage to pass a law that we never could have passed. And if we had said to everybody in the world, let's go after Target just on the janitors, there weren't enough people that cared about janitors. So by going after them on multiple issues at once, and we now in Minnesota, with all the big banks and everybody, have set up community labor bargaining tables. And it's not necessarily related to where we have bargaining rights. It's the idea that there's a community labor table that has a set of demands and that we are constantly agitating about it. And we're building for our every 3 years janitor and security strike. Only in Minnesota do they plan their strikes in January, but the idea then is you're raising all these issues and then we're going to do a big strike that will include civil disobedience and then all these kinds of other issues. But the key on alignment, if we understand who the guys at the top are, and I say guys because it's guys, then we can talk to groups about what they really care about and combine our forces.
Can I just jump in here, because I think part of what the architecture of basically as unions, we're just dealing, for example, in the public sector, literally with the bargaining, right? With the employer being the city, for example, right? And then the city says, well, the Tories just cut, I don't know how much money, we don't have any money. So we would try to go to our MPs and say, hey, nationally, you have to move this at Parliament, and then we obviously campaign for the Labour Party to win. But in the meantime, what's actually happening is that the very players, mostly Tories, but also, unfortunately, Labour Party, are actually being lobbied, right? And so we talked and we know about lobbying from the other side, But what was very interesting about bargaining for the common good, at least in my vision of things, is that I needed to go higher than that, right? Which means if you looked at most employers or big corporations, they also sit on not only chambers of commerce, but they have like business tables, right? They have like their own union, if you will. They have their own clubs, and these clubs are actually entities, and these people meet with each other all the time, and they're actually thinking about their lobbying agendas, right? And then those lobbying agendas get pushed right back into the MPs we're trying to move. Does that make sense? So there's a push from the top, and then there is our push from the bottom, yeah? And part of the conversation about at least what I like about it, is that it takes away the city, it takes away the MPs, and it directs it right. Exactly. Right? Not even to the lobbying groups, because the lobbying groups are a bunch of assholes that are getting paid a lot of money to basically push the agenda of a whole bunch of corporations, or a whole bunch of CEOs, or a whole bunch of equity funds, right? To continue being in the way, right? So it's not only what are we bargaining for, but who's in our way. And most of the time we think it's the city. We really think the employer is the city. And it isn't. It isn't, because, again, the city and the MPs and so on become just like intermediaries of a whole agenda that is being, in our case, in the UK, pushed in for 10 years, right, with the austerity program. What is not clear is who these fucking groups are, right? And we kind of know, and in the United States you have the Koch brothers, and some of these men start becoming kind of the symbols, but we don't have that very clear for ourselves, right? In some regions, that's becoming more of a goal, right? Is to understand what moves the agenda of a city like Manchester, what moves the agenda of, and I mean the right-wing agenda of privatization, right? Because what ends up happening with these players is that they're not only have a name and an address, but they're also obviously organizing these cohorts, and these cohorts then have this, they're in the way of us getting anything, because they're pushing back down, right, as we're trying to push up. And for me, what is important is to understand not only the players, but then obviously what I like about what Stephen is saying and why it's important is where are their interests? Because as unions, we usually strike or we do a demo, but that's not where their interests really lie. Their interest might be their reputation, their interest might be a new investment, or in the case of all these people in general, is to continue having taxation loopholes, taxes being lowered.
Okay, this is
right?
when I do my striptease here.
Yeah.
But keep going. I have a shirt
So,
that reinforces.
Does that make sense what I'm saying? So the agenda also of us refunding the public sector, or refunding particular pieces, right, has to do with that agenda. What is that?
It says hedge funds equal inequality, and on the back.
Did you get a Target, or what is on
It says, what does it say in the back?
Oh, it's just a symbol.
Right.
Sorry, I don't mean to strip you. Oh, hedge clippers.
So we have this campaign called Hedge Clippers that goes after hedge funds, and one of the really fun things when you talk about identifying them is when we show up with 500 people with giant hedge clippers with fake blood on them. And Greenwich, Connecticut is one of the places all the hedge fund rich guys live. And so we've identified who they are, and we do these. If you go on hedgeclippers.org, you'll see these sort of lifestyle of the rich and famous reports on, one guy has a boat that's so big that it can dock another boat there's like 3 different boats. It's sort of amazing how big your boat can be. But anyway, the point being on what you're saying is we identify real live, we're very personal. It's not the abstract evil capitalists. It's Seth Klarman made $1 billion starving Puerto Ricans. It's very personal. We go after them, but we also look at how to cut off their money and all the different ways to put pressure on them.